So in this video, we're going to look at some more advanced topics of programming. And what we're going to do is we're going to further extend our development of the stepper motor control, okay, to see how far we can take it and to look at it, as I said, a couple more advanced features. Now what I've done is I've set up a circuit as shown with our wiring diagram here. So we have a similar setup for the motor. We should be able to wire that in okay. Just remember we need a 5-volt supply. And then along the bottom, what I'm wiring in here is I've got a small push button and I have a potentiometer. So it's giving us an analog input in, okay? And I'm taking 3.3 volts down here at the bottom, all right? So we've seen how to wire up a lot of these. Just remember, with the push button, you need to work diagonally across the pins, okay? So if you're taking this top left pin, you need to take this bottom right pin as your connections. Or if you're using the bottom left, then you would take the top right, okay? So you need to be connected across the way. So this is our setup. Now, essentially what the program is to do is we've previously controlled this stepper motor and we've seen it turn 360 degrees, and then we've seen it turn at a set limit of degrees, so maybe it was 10 degrees, and that's what we set inside the code. And anytime we push the push button, it would just turn 10 degrees, and then push the push button again, it would turn 10 degrees again. Now, if we needed to change the amount of rotation that it was given, we had to go into our code, we had to go into the compiler, and we had to directly change the values. Now what we'd like is a more flexible system that what we can do is we can adjust how much we want the motor to turn through this potentiometer, and then we can push the push button and the motor may turn 20 degrees, may turn 90 degrees, it may turn 360 degrees, depending on how much we rotate this dial. So the more we rotate the dial, the more the motor will turn once we push the push button. So I hope that makes sense and you can see the difference between the two. Now don't forget to compare this to your normal schematic, just so that you know the full way of wiring up the diagram. Now let's look into the code, okay? And what we're going to see is we're going to see the use of functions, okay? So this is something new that we'll be talking about and we'll be spending a bit of time learning about. Now quickly in this video, or as quick as I can make it, we're going to look at it briefly and cover the key aspects of it. Now what you might see is my code has now been sectioned off, or maybe grouped off. So I'm just going to zoom out a wee bit. I know it's a little bit hard to see if I zoom out here, but let me just highlight some areas. We have this, we have all this down here, and then we have this part up here, okay? So we know the part up here is our declarations, okay, and we'll look at some new stuff in there as well. Then we have our main loop, and then we have this function loop here. So this is new, and this is a new group of code. Okay, we know the code inside of it, we've seen that before, but how we've kind of kept it outside of the main loop, this is new. So this is what's called a function, okay? And I'll just quickly, terribly write it here, okay, func. And this is going to do our motor control. So what this does, allows us to kind of group us the code together that we're going to use for the motor control, and it also allows us to reuse this function again and again. So let me just kind of briefly explain what a function is, alright? So what a function does is it takes some inputs, okay? So it takes some inputs, maybe variables or signals or whatever it is, and we apply some code to it, and then it will give us some output, okay? And what we can do is we can group our code into a certain amount of functions, and it gives us a little bit more advanced control, gives it a bit more flexibility, and it actually makes it neater to read all this code here. So if you think about it just in relation to our motor control, the inputs that we're going to give it is, well, how much do you want the motor to turn? Then based on that input, if you tell it, oh, I want you to turn 60 degrees, it will apply the code to it, and turn on the outputs to make it turn 60 degrees. And then what we can do is, again, it reads the inputs. Maybe it's going to turn 90 degrees this time. It'll apply the same code and change the outputs accordingly to turn it 90 degrees. So you see we get a nice kind of cycle here that we can keep reusing this function over and over again. Okay, so that's the kind of idea of what we're doing. Okay, so how do we go about doing that? And we'll explain a little bit here when we get these rubbed out. So I'm not going to go through the motor code again. Look, there's plenty of videos on that. What I am just going to highlight is we now have a new declaration. Okay. So this is our function. So you got to declare any functions that you're going to use. The same way you declare any inputs, any outputs, or whatever it is that you're using, variables, you need to declare, okay, these are the functions I'm using. This is what I'm creating. Okay, this is a user-defined function. And we're calling it motor control. And you see that matches what we have here. Now you'll also see a couple of things need to match. The inputs that we're passing into it will be in the brackets in here. So they must match. And then also this part out here. This is actually what the output returns. Okay. Now, we're not going to cover everything to do with functions in this video, but we're just going to quickly look at a couple of things. So we must declare our function, and then we declare that at the start. We usually do our main bit of code, and then we have all our functions down below. So function is just like a subroutine that's taken in values. Now, so we've declared our function. Let's jump into the main code. Okay, so this is our main loop. It's gotten nice and short now. It's quickly to read, and we've kind of grouped things off. So all we're saying is we've got a while loop, and it's going to constantly just loop around, and it's waiting for a push button to be pressed. So if we press the push button, it's going to read the value of the potentiometer. It's going to calculate or scale that to a value of 360, so that's the amount of rotation. And then what we're going to do is we're going to call our function. See the way that matches the name there? Okay. So if we just want to call the function, we just need to use its name and then pass in the inputs to it. And then it waits 2 seconds, and then it'll go and loop around. Okay. So this part here to do with the reading the potentiometer, I'm not going to go over that again. Again, we have videos on that. So we're going to assume that people are comfortable with it. And essentially, just depending on how much the potentiometer is turned, it's going to tell the motor to either turn 0 degrees or 10 degrees or 50 degrees, all the way up to 360. So that's the value that we're passing in here. Okay. Once we calculate this angle, we're telling the motor, we're saying, take in that angle, whatever we said we wanted to turn, let's say it worked it out at 15 degrees, it's going to pass the value of 15 degrees in here, and then the 1 just means do you want it to go forward or backwards. That was that directional control. So if it was a 0 there, it would go reverse, 1 just means it goes forward. So this motor will always turn forward. But we have the flexibility to do either or. So based on what way the potentiometer is set up, it will pass in an angle into that function. Right, so now let's look a little bit more at what's happening here. Let me just tidy up some things again. Okay, so what we have is the main loop runs consistently. Okay, remember we're doing this sequentially. So if we get the push button, it'll do this line, it does this line, it does this line, and then it calls the function. So what we do then is we exit the main loop and we come down and we run the code for our function. So it'll go through all this code, and then once it's finished, it'll come back out, all the way back in, goes to its wait command, and then it will loop back around within the main. So you can see we're in the main function, then we're calling a separate function, it goes out, does that bit of code, and then comes back in. So hopefully you can see that. Now, when we go into the motor control, right? So remember, we're passing in a value because it's worked it out from here. So we said, okay, maybe it's 15 degrees. So what happens? Now, like I said, I'm not going to go through all this code again, and we hopefully are familiar with that now. But I'm just going to look at this first part here. Remember, it passes in an angle, and then we've got to work out how many steps. So previously we just put in a value, we did the mathematical calculation, and we said, okay, if it needs to turn 10 degrees, it was like 57 steps or something we had to put in there. But now all I'm doing is I've just got a quick formula here that will work out the total amount of steps for me. So I know if my angle, we were saying we wanted to turn 15 degrees, then I can just divide that by the single step angle, because that's pretty much what it's there. So it takes 2048 steps to turn 360 degrees. That means each step will turn 0.18 degrees. So if you divide that from your 15, it will work out how many steps you need to turn. So then that'll pass that in there, and it will turn the amount of steps required, and then it will go back in to your main loop. It'll wait 2 seconds, and then again, if we push that push button, it will go in, read the potentiometer value. Maybe that has changed to let's say 100 degrees this time, because we've changed the potentiometer. It goes in here, it works out, okay, how many steps will it take me to turn 100 degrees, and then it runs that code and comes back out. So that's pretty much what's happening in this code. Hopefully it makes sense. Okay, it's not everything to do with functions, but it's the general idea. We've separated out our code, separated out from the main loop, just because that is, if you think about it, that's a dedicated function. It's a dedicated part of our code that's set up just to deal with the motor control. So we can group that nicely together, we can tweak it, and then we can just call it in the main loop. And it makes our code a little bit more readable and easy to use. And the good thing is we needed to change something here, we can change it easily here, and it'll always update. You know, you could be calling maybe your function, you could call it more than once or twice or whatever it is, but you just keep this code here, and if you ever edit it, it would update in here automatically. So I hope that makes sense. We will look a little bit at, you know, what are the inputs in here, what's the data types, what does this void mean. We'll look at that a little bit more as we go through the sessions, but hopefully kind of conceptually and a good overview, that is what the function is doing. And it's grouped our code nicely, and it's made it a little bit more easier to read. So remember again, we're turning this potentiometer, so it's going to change pretty much how much we want the motor to turn each time, and then once we push the push button, it will take that new angle and then get the motor to turn whatever it needs to turn.